Welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'm your host, Various Artists, and please join me as I time travel back and revisit almost every live show I've ever seen from 1975 to the present. Hey everyone, your host, Various Artists here, and welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. Now, this is episode 5, and in this series, I'm starting it by looking at one concert from each of the 5 decades when I've been a concert goer. Episode 1 was the introduction, so episode 2 was Roxy Music in 1975. In the 80s, it was the Ramones and the Demics in 1980. That was episode 3. Episode 4 looked at Lollapalooza in 1992 with Soundgarden, Ministry, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Pearl Jam, and Lush. And today I'm jumping forward to the 2000s, and my selection for the concert I'm going to discuss from that decade was, unfortunately, the last time I was to see David Bowie live, although it was an incredible show. And so episode 5 of MyLifeInConcert.com is Never Get Old. David Bowie with the Polyphonic Spree, April 2nd, 2004 at the Corel Centre, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. So I'll start with what was happening in my life in between that 12-year gap between Lollapalooza in 1992 and where I was musically and personally in 2004. Now, in the last episode, I was looking at the Lollapalooza tour coming to Barrie, Ontario in the Toronto region in the summer of 92, and that really was at the height of the grunge explosion and that whole Amarindy rock sound that had started in the 80s sort of as a post-hardcore offshoot and then exploding and marketed as grunge in the early 1990s. As it turned out, it was really one of the last sort of really big, interesting rock movements. Now, at the start of the century, we had that garage band explosion, reinterpreting and looking back on that sound from the 60s. You know, we had the Strokes and the White Stripes and the Yeah Yeahs, et cetera, et cetera. Grunge was the last really sort of big thing in that realm, and it had been long overdue, as I discussed in the last episode. Especially on this side of the Atlantic, there really hadn't been an underground movement going overground that was like raw and interesting, really, since the 60s. And in terms of the amount of shows I was seeing, when the podcast hits that point in the story, there's going to be a ton of shows. The late 80s, early 90s is the time when I was seeing the most amount of live shows at every size, every level, and in a variety of genres. I believe that 1989 is the year that I saw the most number of live shows, discounting, going to see local bands at the bar, but ticketed shows. I think it works out to that I would have seen a concert every 2 weeks throughout that year. So that's going to take a while to get through. Now, as for myself, in the 12 years, there was a lot of lifestyle changes as well. In 1992, I was still an undergrad in university, and at this point in 2004, by this point I had finished my university, finished grad school, moved to Ottawa, and had a professional career in government there. As I mentioned in the last episode, this evolution of my tastes and finding all different types of music really exploded during this period. Certainly in the 90s, you had grunge in the first half of the decade. In the latter half, there was more of a shift towards electronic and electronica and that kind of music, which I was also very into as well. But I kept going further and further back. And of course, the big thing that happened was, well, for me, there was 2 things that happened at once. Napster in 2000, which we got twinned with getting a CD burner. And at this point, I think I spent several years just downloading things and making tons and tons of compilation CDs. Suddenly, I had every tune that I had ever wanted at my disposal and could also make digital files of some of the stuff I couldn't find. And with these things, I just kept going deeper and deeper and exploring more and more different types of music. For instance, I started going heavily back into a lot of the pre-rock pop and those kinds of singers, a lot of music from the 20s through the 50s. I got very much into Brazilian music. On the other hand, I was able to hear a lot of really early experimental avant-garde and electronic music, so it was just going off in every direction. Now, on a personal level, I met my spouse-to-be and partner of 21 years at this time, who shall be known as Cublet, and will be joining me on this and a few other podcasts down the line, as we've seen a lot of shows together. So I was leading a very different kind of life in Ottawa, but I still managed to see one show a year all through this. I've always seen from 77 onwards at least one show per year, although it looks like with 2020 that may be coming to an end. And it was certainly a case of being in Ottawa. A lot of things, I did see some shows in that period, but in this early half around where David Bowie was, this is kind of the period where things start picking up and we start having different kinds of acts coming to the city that were more interesting to me. And the big reason for that was, or what was behind it, is Ottawa was slowly turning into a music city. And what was really behind that were the three big festivals, especially Blues Fest. Blues Fest had started in 94, I believe, as a small blues festival in Ottawa and grew, but at some point right around the turn of the century, as they moved to a larger location, they realized that people were getting into different types of music and began to diversify who they were booking. And in between, say, 2001, 2002, and 2005, the festival was transformed. They kept the name, but by that point and from there onward, Blues Fest really is a multi-genre festival where you have a variety of different types of music playing out over 10 to 12 nights on 4 to 5 stages. This exposed a lot more artists to Ottawa, along with the Jazz Festival, which grew during this time and diversified, and also the Folk Festival, which had been going and had a couple of rough years with bad weather, and then Blues Fest eventually took over, and it's now City Folk. But the point of it is we had these three big festivals. They grew and grew. They brought all sorts of new and interesting acts into the city, and it created this climate where more and more and better acts were coming through. However, I have to say that this show, Bowie coming to Ottawa, being able to see him in my own backyard, this was by far the most delighted I had been about a show since Joni Mitchell came to town with Bob Dylan in 98. We had seen him in Montreal a few months before, and in fact, this was the 5th time I was seeing him. The first time, and these are all coming up, was in 1983 at CNE Stadium with Rough Trade. That's coming up down the line as show number 22. And then there was the Glass Spider Tour in 1987, also at CNE Stadium with Duran Duran and the Spoons. That'll be show number 41. Then in the 1990s, I saw him in 1990 on the Sound and Vision Tour at Skydome in Toronto, and that will be show 67. And then we had seen him a few months previously at the start of this tour, the start of the North American leg of the tour, in Montreal, and that's show number 103. And of course, this is the next show, 104. Now, each one of these shows has an aspect about it, a feature about it, that makes it completely unique. So none of these 5 shows really blend together for me, even the last 2. With the show in 1983, that's easy. It's probably the most exciting show I've ever been to. I'd been such a fan. It was 10 years in the making that I was finally going to get to see him. It was the show I was probably most anticipating more than any other show I've ever seen. So it was probably the most exciting concert performance I've been to. Now, the 1987 show, also at CNE Stadium, the Glass Spider Tour, that one is unique in my mind as the Crap-A-Doodle show. It really was a low point in David's career, something that he himself copped to, and we'll be getting back to at the end of the show. It was pretty much a trying disaster. It was the one bad show I've seen him play. But just as Fleabag learned in her TV series, everybody makes mistakes. Now, in 1990, things improved substantially with the Sound and Vision tour that I saw at Skydome. And the interesting thing is that he had planned the Glass Spider tour to be this big visual spectacle, but as he realized, there was just all these small details that got lost, and it just didn't work. It was this overblown mess. Whereas the Sound and Vision tour, he brought the idea back from the Station to Station tour of having everything in black and white. There was no color. Actually, the band was behind the stage. It was not so good for musicians, but it was this stark minimalist show all in black and white with these huge screens, and La La Human Steps from Montreal doing this dancing through the show. Visually, this was the most interesting Bowie show I saw. It really was a visual spectacle. So simple and infinitely more memorable than the, overdone Glass Spider tour. Now, the next time I saw him was in 2003, and it was the Montreal show from just a few months previous. And for me, that's a bit of, well, actually, both of these last two shows have a magic element to them, but those elements are different, and this is what I'll get to. The show in Montreal came early on in the North American leg of the tour. He'd gone through Europe and was then starting over here, and I think Montreal was the sixth or seventh date on the tour, 5th, 6th, 7th. And he came down with a bad flu, which forced him to cancel the first couple of shows. And so we had tickets for the show in Montreal. It was also my birthday weekend. Cublet was a fan. He'd never seen him. And then another show got canceled, and then another. And we were like, oh, damn, looks like we're not going to Montreal for this gig. He's not going to be up to it. And then word went out, Montreal's on. This is the start of the tour. And we were like, yes. So we were really happy that the show actually happened, because we were planning to cancel it, and it was kind of a miracle that it happened. And this 5th show in Ottawa has 2 significant elements to it. First, the big memory for me is that musically, this was probably the most interesting. I don't want to say too much about the Montreal show, because I'll eventually be doing a whole piece on that way down the line. But because he was still recovering, the Montreal show was relatively short, because he was doing almost 3-hour shows a night on this tour. And the Montreal show was, I think, like an hour and 45 minutes, hour 50 minutes, And at the end of it, he actually came out and said, I didn't know whether or not I'd be able to make it through this evening, but, you've been a great crowd and blah, blah, blah. So when we saw him at this show, as I'll be getting to, it was a much longer show with all sorts of surprises that I could not have believed. The other thing that was magic about this had to do with how I procured the tickets, or what happened as I procured the tickets. I'm assuming that many that are listening are concert goers themselves, and the routine of getting tickets for gigs, and it's changed through the years. I mean, we used to have to stand in line, and this was kind of at a pretty good point in time when buying things online wasn't too bad, and the bots hadn't completely come in and screwed with everything. That could literally be a whole show of me venting on bots and how it prevents people these days from even having a chance at good tickets, it seems. And so on the morning that the tickets went on sale for this, I was all ready. I had several different browsers open. I was looking at the time. I had everything ready to go. I had the website open. Everything was ready. And one thing I've known through the years is that in terms of when tickets go on sale, generally it's bang on. It's pretty much perfect. You can look at your digital time on your computer screen, and my personal experience is those tickets go on sale pretty much right to the second. I've never had a situation where that hasn't happened, except for this gig. Because what I always did when I was trying to get tickets is, and I'm sure you do as well, is about, say, 4 or 5 minutes to, I just start refreshing all the browsers to be able to buy tickets. And again, it always just went all the way to 10. This morning, I don't know what happened or why, but the tickets went on sale 1 minute early. And I'm looking over at the clock. Immediately, it's like, oh, God, I'm in. It's 9:59. And I'm doing all this, and I'm looking. It's still 9:59. It's still 9:59. It was a minute early. And that minute allowed me to get 12th row tickets, I think it was. I'll have to check the ticket again, but I think it's 12th row. So we were close. When he came on, he was just there, just a few yards away. Okay, now, in terms of the impact Bowie had on my life, it was massive. Certainly one of the most impactful performers whose work I've been a fan of. However, I don't want to go too much into that at this time, as concert number 22 will be coming up down the line in 1983, and I'll talk more about that then. And if you really want to know sort of about my background and why he was important and in what ways, I have a piece on the blog, Bowie, the 70s and Me, in conjunction with the 1983 show and its concert number 22. You can read it on the mylifeinconcert.com blog. So for now, I'll just say that discovering him made a big and lasting impact on my life, and indeed, I have followed him all through these years. So instead, what I want to focus on is kind of where he had been when I had last seen him in 1990. Well, I'd seen him in Montreal a few months before, but it was the same tour. So just to sort of go over where his career had been in that time. Now, I think it's safe to say he had a really lousy 1980s. Artistically, of course, his biggest album was Let's Dance, and that's a good one, but it was pretty slim pickings after that. His mid to late 80s is pretty poor. There's little moments here and there, but he really kind of got lost. And again, this is something he himself acknowledged. It's no big secret. And in the 90s, he started working his way back. Definitely his work in the 90s was more interesting than the post-Let's Dance work in the 80s. But in many ways, I kind of feel the same way about his 90s work as I do his 60s work, in that there's a lot of things in there that I like, but there's not a lot of things that seem to be absolutely bang on, totally, fully realized. With his 60s work and his 90s work, it always seems like there's just something, one little thing that doesn't work or isn't missing, and almost there, getting there, but not quite. And I truly feel that in this century, especially when he put out Heathen in 2002, he really came back. Now, that's an album he had put out, gotten a lot of acclaim on, and he had now followed it up with A Reality a year later. And of the 4 albums he did this century, Heathen, A Reality, The Next Day, and Black Star, I think A Reality is the substandard one. It's okay, it's not bad, but it's not on the level of the others. Even if the album was a bit patchy and weaker, it still had some great songs. The opening cut, New Killer Star, which was the single, is one of his absolute best latter-day tunes, and a really great sort of crunching rock song that he tried to write later on, but they didn't always necessarily come off as well as this one. I also have a lot of love for the very last track on the album, Bring Me the Disco King, that sort of long, jazzy one with a lot of Mike Garson's piano. And I was hearing it the other day and thinking in many ways this kind of is where he ended up going with some of the stuff on Black Star, at least some of the elements of that. Anyway, he wanted to do this huge world tour in 2003, and for a number of reasons. He had a daughter with Iman. Of course, he'd gotten married and was very happily married, and he had his daughter, which I believe he called Lexi. Well, it's Alexandra, but he called her Lexi. And he knew she was going to be going to school and wanted to sort of be there as a parent at that time. So what I heard is that he wanted to do this tour while he was still free to do that, and he didn't have to be home all the time, and he could fulfill both roles, because I know that he felt he had really missed out on a lot of things because his career took off when his young son, Zoe, then called Zoe, now Joe, was a child, and he didn't want to repeat that. He'd also been on a roll with the band that he had. He'd been playing a lot more gigs. Again, it's sort of gone through that 90s where not everything was coming together, but he really had this amazing band by the end of the decade. He was touring and playing with them, and he knew it. And that was another thing, is to go out on tour with this great group of musicians who really played well together and just delivered a great show. So the band were Earl Slick on guitar. Now, he had started playing with David Bowie in 74 on the David Live Tour and does all that great guitar work on Station to Station. And he had been in and out of the Bowie universe for years. Jerry Leonard, who really took over as musical director, he was the guitarist, backing vocalist, but was the musical director, and I don't feel he gets quite enough credit. I think he was a very low-key person, and he really engineered the bands. He was looking after the bands, and I think the great sounds and the way the band plays on those last few albums, he had a big part in that, in helping Bowie create that sound, and he deserves a lot of credit. Then there was his amazing bald female bass player, Gail Ann Dorsey, who just sang well, an incredible bass player. and just really had a presence on the stage. If you go see live shows, you know that people can be good musicians and play, but they don't always necessarily have a presence. And I don't know, that woman really has a presence. And when they did Under Pressure together, fantastic. Then there's Sterling Campbell on drums, a great drummer who played with him before and after. And Mike Garson, he'd been playing with Bowie for a long, long time, going back to the Spiders tour in America in '72 and the Aladdin Sane album. He's the one who plays all that really wild avant-garde piano on the title track. And I know he'd gotten into Scientology, and so he sort of moved away from the Bowie camp, but he came right back in later on and played with Bowie in all those later years, and fantastic pianist and keyboard player. And Catherine Russell playing keyboards, percussion, guitar, and backing vocals. She rounded out the band, and this is truly one of the best live bands he ever had. I still think the band he had for stage is my favorite, and the Spiders were the best sort of just rock out band. But this group of musicians he played with in his later years were just superb, and they complemented each other so well. Now, when the day of the show came, it was a beautiful, beautiful Friday, April 2nd, 2004. We went with a couple of people we knew at the time, but generally I mostly just remember the two of us interacting between each other. Now, it was in Ottawa, in Canada, far on the West End, at the Corel Center, as it was called at the time. Now, this was this big sports and performing complex that had just opened when I arrived in January of 1996. And at the time, it was called the Palladium. And quite frankly, they never bettered the name. I always thought that was a great name. And within a few months, it had been changed to, I can't even remember now. It's one of these places. It's a big, anonymous building. And the one thing that makes those places kind of special is if they have sort of a unique name, and it just has basically had one corporate brand stamped on it after another. And corporate renaming of all these buildings, it's another bee in my bonnet. I'll have maybe a podcast about that, sort of like corporate renaming of buildings and bots stopping you from getting tickets. There we go, two of my pet peeves, big pet peeves. Now, we got in and got seated, and as I said, we had killer tickets. When we got to the seats and realized, again, just how close we were, absolutely sweet. But the opening act on the tour were on first, and it was the Polyphonic Spree. Now, Macy Gray had been the opener in Montreal a few months earlier, and now we had the Polyphonic Spree, which I was very excited about seeing. Now, they kind of had their big heyday in the early 2000s. And they were a band put together, well, not a band, this whole unit, basically a sort of a psychedelic choir put together by Tom DeLauter, I believe. You pronounce his name, from Tripping Daisy. And it was this, I think it's still going, this huge choir along with a small band. And they would do these sort of anthemic alt pop songs, but with this huge mass of voices behind it. And it was really, really incredible to see and to hear. A true audio-visual experience. I know I really enjoyed their music at the time. I had a few of their CDs, but they really are one of these acts where the records are fine, but it was really all about seeing them live with the power of that choir. And it's a weird thing for choirs for me, because I know people who are involved with choirs, and choirs in and of themselves just don't do it for me. If music was food, then choirs would be condiments. And by that, what I mean is I can really appreciate a choir when it's part of something else. There's many songs where the choral aspect is one of the key things I like. For instance, Cargo Cult by Serge Gainsbourg, or You Can't Always Get What You Want with the Boys Choir, the Rolling Stones. So there's tunes that are like that have those elements, and the choral element really brings it alive. However, taken on their own, I don't find choirs or choir singing really that interesting. But this was a great use of that, probably because it was such an unusual use of it in terms of the material they were doing, but it just worked perfectly. It was really something and really overwhelming. Now, I know that St. Vincent, her real name Annie Clark, and one of my favorite contemporary artists, I believe she was part of this collective at that time. So she may have been playing at the show, playing or singing at the show. I believe she was a musician in the band, but I would have to check that out. But of course, her career was still yet to come. She was one of the people to pass through that group and then emerge at the other end with quite a career. They were also visually arresting, not only by the number of people on the stage, but also because of these psychedelic robes the members wore. The look gave the Polyphonic Spree this very happy but also kind of slightly evil cult. There was just this dark undertone to it. And of course, I like dark undertones. So anyway, I really enjoyed the opening set. I thought it was one of the best opening acts I ever saw David Bowie have. And so once the Polyphonic Spree were wrapped up, it was just a waiting game before he arrived, and bingo, there he was. And when he arrived on stage, it just looked amazing. And we were pretty close, too. We weren't really watching the screens. It was more about he was just a few yards away. And just absolutely incredible, looked years younger, full of energy. You would never know what was about to happen. He didn't arrive on stage just on his own. Actually, the intro to the show was very, very interesting. They started by playing this highly stylized animation, which you later realize was the band itself in a studio playing this instrumental track, of which I don't know the name. It's a great track and it hasn't been on any of his albums, but it's just the band playing in an animated, stylized form, and then the screen moved, the animation part moved from right to left, revealing the actual band on screen playing behind them. Then the real band members themselves would walk across on a catwalk in front of the screen and then down to the stage with Bowie at the end. It was a clever and simple but visually interesting way to start the show. And, of course, he went down, took center stage. They launched into Rebel Rebel, which is always such a great show opener. Everyone was going nuts. Great start to an evening. And as he said early on, he goes, I hope that you're all comfortable and settling in because we're going to be together for a while this evening, something to that effect. And it was like, yes, this is going to be a long show. And he delivered on all counts. Now, what was interesting about this tour is the band had spent a lot of time rehearsing, and rather than a standard set that would be played from night to night to night, there was a core set that they kept going back to, but they had a large amount of material from throughout his career that they had rehearsed. And each night he would draw up a set list and it changed from night to night. That's probably one of the reasons the performance was so fresh. It was always a little bit different for the musicians as well. Now, I have to say that he ended up releasing a DVD of the tour of the stop in Dublin. And if you're at all interested in seeing a version of what I saw on that night, I cannot recommend the video enough. It's called A Reality Live. And it's fairly close to what I saw. Of course, there were some differences I'll get to in a moment, but the sense of the show, the main points, the music, the vibe, the feel, it really captures that concert. And I've watched that live video many times. I really enjoy it. It's very well done, and you really get a sense of what was happening on that tour. Now, one of the things that was similar about this and the Dublin show is they were both very long shows. As I mentioned, the show in Montreal was a little bit truncated owing to poor health. So what I did is I looked over, I've got the video. Then I found the set list for the show in Ottawa, and I also looked at the set list for the show in Montreal. And in each case, there's a few key songs performed that are unique to the performance here in Ottawa. But I know that he did a whole slew of songs that, if you ask me before going in, okay, name a whole bunch of David Bowie songs that you absolutely love and would love to see him perform live, but it just ain't going to happen. They're just too obscure. They don't work in a live context. You're just not going to see them. Well, a whole bunch of them ended up showing up this night, especially near the end of the night. Now, he performed 32 songs at this show. That's 2 more than on the reality vid and 9 more than we saw in Montreal. Granted, of course, there were a lot of the biggies that we all wanted to hear. Rebel Rebel, Fame. He did All the Young Dudes. As I mentioned earlier, he started doing Under Pressure on this tour with Gail Ann Dorsey taking Freddie Mercury's part, and that was one of the highlights of the evening. Also, he was starting to perform The Man Who Sold the World again. We also got a version of Modern Love here in Ottawa that it doesn't seem was performed a ton during the tour. And of course, there was Ashes to Ashes, Heroes, Changes, and more. But for me, again, it was some of the deep cuts, specifically A New Career and a New Town and Be My Wife off of Low, especially A New Career and a New Town, an instrumental track. And then the third last track of the main set was Quicksand off of Hunky Dory, and I just about lost it. That is such a huge favorite of mine, and I just couldn't even conceive that he would be performing that. I particularly treasured every moment of those performances. And it's interesting with A New Career and a New Town, that song. It's an instrumental track. It closes side one of Low. I'll also interject that Low is not only my favorite Bowie album, but I chose it as one of my top 15 albums of all time in sort of an open call thing I did over on Open Salon. And I've posted that list on the mylifeinconcert.com website if interested. It's one of those tunes. It's instrumental, and you look at the title, and for me, the song completely expresses what's in the title. I remember actually shortly after arriving and living in Ottawa, I'd moved to this new city. I was starting a career. I didn't know anyone there. And being on one of the transit ways home and having it would have been my Walkman at the time. And I had a Bowie compilation on or something, and A New Career in a New Town came on, and I was in this packed bus full of people, and the song really resonated because there was all this excitement of being in this new place, and the song has that pulse, that excitement, there's that optimism, but there's also a wistfulness. You're leaving things behind, moving on. So it's this mixture of sort of the wistfulness that you hear in the harmonica as well as the propulsion in the instrument. So it's a song that I'd listened to for years, but I also have that memory from those early days in Ottawa. So it's kind of a personally special thing for me that he did that track, as I have that association with it. Elsewhere, the other big thing was the encore. He did a 6-song encore with Blue Jean, not a bad pop tune from the 80s, but apparently that wasn't performed a ton, so that was good. Changes, and then finally a 4-song Ziggy finale. Starman, 5 Years, Suffragette City, and Ziggy Stardust from the Ziggy Stardust album. And also earlier on in the main set, he'd done Hang On to Yourself. So he did almost half the album. And also Starman, that was the song that really launched his consistent career in Britain. He'd had a hit with Space Oddity in 1969, but Starman and Ziggy Stardust, that's the true launch of his stardom, as it were. And it's weird because for years he didn't do Starman very much. I don't know why. It was really the song that put him on the map over there. And he did it. I was so thrilled when I realized that was the song he was doing. And let me tell you, when I heard those opening drum beats to 5 Years, bliss and joy. Took me right back to hearing and discovering Ziggy Stardust in 1973. A couple of others of note was he did I've Been Waiting for You, which is a Neil Young song off Neil Young's first album. And as you'll be finding out as the series goes on, I'm a Neil Young nut as well. Both Bowie and Neil will be coming up many times in this series. And while that first Neil Young album, I think it's not one of his best. It's got some great tunes on it. Some things don't work. That song, I've Been Waiting for You, is a huge fave. So when Heathen came out in 2002 and he did a really good cover of it, I thought, well, that's a cool choice. It's a Neil Young song that I had liked a lot, but didn't seem to get a lot of mention, and a lot of people didn't know it as much. So I thought that was a great choice of a cover, and I was so happy he did it. And I remember at the end of it, him saying that was by your Neil Young. Of course, he's here in Canada. Another song that really jumps out at me was Slip Away. Now, that's a track from Heathen. And I mentioned earlier, talking about Heathen, when that album came out, I liked it, but not as much as, say, some of the reviews that were going at the time. And to Cublet's credit, he loved it right off the bat. That's been one of those albums, it's been a creeper. Over the years, more and more I've gone back to it, and now I love it. I absolutely love that album. And my favorite track on there is Slip Away, the song about Uncle Floyd. It was a cable access show in New York, kind of a kid show, but It was sort of the hip thing to watch in that time. And he wrote this song about it, which I had liked on the album, but when I saw him do it live, and he had this great video going with snippets from the show, it really brought home what a great song it is. And ever since that performance, this has been one of my absolute favorite latter-day Bowie songs, or of any time. I think it's a great song, and it's one I always really enjoy hearing, and I'll sometimes play it 2 or 3 times in a row. I've also put up a YouTube link on the website to a video where Bowie talks about watching the show with John Lennon and Iggy Pop in the 70s before performing Slip Away. Overall, this was a much more stripped down show than his previous concerts that I'd seen. There wasn't a lot of costumes or changes. The focus really was more about the music, on the core performance, the catalog. You know, there were light show elements. There was the very interesting opening, and they did continue to use elements of video through the set. But in general, really the focus was on the music, celebrating the music. And essentially it was kind of a revolving jukebox of all that he had done from date to date throughout the tour. As I mentioned earlier, while all of the 5 Bowie shows that I saw had aspects that made each unique in my mind, if I'm thinking of a show that just for the music, the performances, the set list, everything, musically, this was the best set I ever saw him play. And it was a really interesting set list for fans. It was like a gift for fans that possibly was turning off some of the more casual fans. One thing I remember was reading the review the next day. Now, I thought I had it somewhere, but I haven't been able to find it, and I couldn't find it online. But the Ottawa Citizen gave the show a bad review. I can't remember who wrote it, but it was hilarious because basically Bowie, the last time Bowie had played Ottawa was the Glass Spider Tour, which we talked about earlier, was his low point. And you can just go on the internet and see Bowie talking about this. I think he took one of the spiders and burned it in the Australian desert at the end of the tour because he was so sick of it and it had just been so frustrating. He ended up with that tour. He made a lot on it, but his critical standing was just emaciated after that. And it kind of was the end of all of his credibility. And he really started to build back after that. And by this point, he was now and had finally regained his ground. But I had noticed that especially in the middle part of the show with the more obscure stuff, people were walking out. Can you believe that? Think about that. People walked out, but then again, we're talking Ottawa, and that's a whole other story. And that was the thing the next day in the Citizen. Whoever wrote the review was going on about, he did this great show with the Glass Spider, and this was a disappointment, and there's all these obscure numbers, and people were walking out, and good Lord, get a grip. I can assure you that true David Bowie fans would not have been in any way disappointed with this show. And now, what I'd like to do is I'm going to bring Cublet, my spouse, into the conversation. Now, he was at the gig with me as well as the gig in Montreal a few months earlier. Say hello to all the listeners, Cublet.
Hello, all listeners.
Thanks for joining me and talking about the show. But we'll start off by me asking you, how did you first come to know about David Bowie's music? How did you come to learn about him?
Well, for myself, I remember growing up hearing about David Bowie through actually older siblings of friends. I would go over to friends' houses and they would have a few David Bowie albums out, and they'd be playing albums like Scary Monsters and Low and that sort of thing. And I always thought this is really interesting, and I was actually really fascinated by the artwork on the albums too, because it was just completely surreal. And I guess it really hit closer to home when my sister actually bought a copy of Scary Monsters herself and was playing it quite regularly. And I found it so interesting because of my age. I was kind of growing up in that kind of like being a child of the 80s. Not so much familiar with music from, the punk kind of glam era myself. I was kind of more into new wave, British electronic. That's sort of the type of music I was listening to. And
so you've heard lots of the other in the intervening years living with me.
Oh, of course, absolutely, absolutely. But I guess for me, it was like this was sort of like the precursor to the kind of the genre that I was into, and it was like, wow, this is really interesting. And then, of course, when video was coming out, I was seeing a lot of videos, and they were playing a lot of course, a lot of the current David Bowie videos, but there was also a lot of the earlier videos. And again, it was just, wow, this is so, for me, it seemed so cutting edge and so ahead of its time. And that really impressed me. So that's how I sort of became familiar with him.
I know you've talked to me about seeing that Ashes to Ashes video as well.
Oh, I love that video. It's actually one of my, probably on my top, I'd say my top 20 list of favorite music videos.
And I remember when we went to the David Bowie Is exhibition in Toronto, they had the suit from the video. That was a highlight for you seeing that.
Oh, I think if I remember correctly, I almost shrieked in like delight seeing the suit. It was like, oh my God, there's the suit. It was just amazing.
Yeah, well, that show itself was incredible, all the ephemera that it had. It was really something. So what was the attraction to the music?
I think I kind of answered that question because I think for me it was like, again, it was like kind of rediscovering the precursor to the music, the genre that I was into. That's what kind of attracted me to it, because it was kind of like it filled in a gap in terms of, like, I was familiar with music from the 60s and a lot of the North American music from the early 70s. I just from listening to it on radio, but there was that period kind of in the late 70s to the beginning of the 80s where I didn't know a lot of that kind of segment of music, at least in terms of British music, and so that really kind of helped fill in the void for myself.
And then years later, in 2003, and then at this show in 2004, you finally get to see him live. You're lucky enough to see him twice. Many never got to see him at all. You got to see him twice, so lucky you. Now, we won't talk much about the Montreal show because way down the line, I'm going to be doing a separate piece on that one. So you had seen him a few months earlier. Now, in terms of this show, when he came back around and we saw him 6 months later, what are your memories of the show? Do you have any memories of the show, either before, after, during the music? What are some things that stand out in your mind?
Well, I guess the main thing was the fantastic seats and sight lines we had for the show. The fact that, I had been to other concerts in arenas, but generally it's, you're further back, and you're kind of reliant on the screens to kind of see what's going on, because you're kind of having to kind of navigate yourself around, people singing in front of you. Usually with all these shows, you're always going to have that one person who's like 6'7", standing near you. So you have to kind of strain your neck to kind of see past it. But where we were in terms of this show, like, first off, everyone ahead of us was relatively short.
Which you reminded me of last night. I'd forgotten that tidbit. We were super lucked out on that one.
So we had complete open sight lines to the whole stage. And just the fact too that because we were, approximately 12 rows back, as you were saying, he was right there. You could literally kind of reach out and touch David, and he was essentially there. It was almost like he was performing for you in your living room. That was, for me, was one of the big things. I guess the other thing too was just the visuals. Like I love concert visuals. I've always find that I've always been a very visual person, and I always find when visuals are used in a concert effectively, they really can add to the show. And I found those visuals that they had in that show were just amazing. Like they didn't overpower the show, but at the same time too, they seemed to really tie into what was happening on the stage.
It complemented what was going on rather than taking away from it.
Exactly. And also just the band too, and also to the one performer, and I think you have mentioned her as well too, the bass player,
Gail Ann Dorsey.
Yeah, just again, just an amazing stage presence. To me, she seemed almost kind of otherworldly. She was just like first off, I mean, the bass was massive, and she's
tiny and the bass is massive.
Exactly,
I know, it's a huge honor.
Exactly, and for me, she just kind of gravitated around the stage with that guitar, and it was just mesmerizing for me.
Yeah, as I said earlier in the podcast, there's lots of people who can be very talented, but not everyone has that stage charisma. Of course, Bowie had it in spades, but I know what you mean. You really noticed her. First, she was very striking looking, she seemed to have this aura about her when she was on stage, is the best way to put it.
Oh, absolutely.
And from the show, anything else that stands out, or any of the visuals that you remember from the show, or things that jump out at you, or...
Well, I know with the opening act, the Polyphonic Spree, those robes they were wearing, it was just dark, and it was, again, just visually striking. And there was that one video, the one song, Afraid of Americans, I think it's called.
The Bowie song?
Yeah.
I'm Afraid of Americans.
I'm Afraid of Americans. That's okay. That's because that's the one I found that was the most striking in terms of the visuals.
Interesting, because now I'm trying to think of the visuals for that. I have to rewatch the video.
They had like Captain America. They had like all these sort of, the flags and Captain America and all this stuff. It was just 3 or 4 screen panels set up, and they were like flashing sporadically across the screen.
Oh, I'd forgotten that. See, isn't it interesting how different people remember different aspects of shows? That's why I want to get different voices and perspectives coming through on the show. And
of course, there was that other video, the one with the puppet.
Yeah, Slip Away, Uncle Floyd. Right. They had all the video clips of the character, the Uncle Floyd character. And it was actually quite humorous, but the song itself, seeing it performed, as I was saying earlier, that's when I really took notice of that song when I saw him perform it live. I really went back and took a deeper listen, and that's become a big, big favorite in the last couple of decades.
That album in general is my favorite.
Your all-time? I thought Scary Monsters was your favorite.
No, Heath. Well, it's kind of a tie between the two. I think of the older albums, I would say Scary Monsters. Of the newer albums, I would say it would be Heathen.
Yeah, because I remember you were really into that when I bought it, and I liked it. But as I said earlier, that's one has really grown on me, and that's a favorite of mine now. It just took some time to really seep in. So to wrap up, do you have any final thoughts on the gig, memories, impressions, thoughts about having been able to see him, that sort of thing? Any last words?
I think, again, because he has such a kind of a strong visual persona, and of course all the different caricatures that he's done in the past, caricatures, I should say, to see him on the stage, just like an average Joe up there playing and performing, to me it was almost like a personable kind of connection, because it's like, here he is up there, he's been, aging in years, and to see him up there and just performing so strongly and so having so much energy and just essentially being David. And, he wasn't being any of these other personas. I think for me that was, and this be so close, I think for me was the big thing. It was almost like meeting somebody and having them to sort of play a set of music for you, and almost kind of like with the wrapper off, like pure David, pure raw David. Yeah,
it was very, as you said, very personable. Of course, we were close, so it's easy to say that it was intimate, but it was a much more intimate kind of show. Of course, he did these big spectacle things in the past, which were great, but this show I loved because it was just him and the band performing the songs. And it was such an amazing set list that covered so many different areas. It was, I feel that musically, this was the best David Bowie show I ever saw.
And for myself, other than the performance in Montreal, this was the only David Bowie show I ever saw. So, but I have to be honest, it was amazing. And I'm kind of glad that I had the opportunity to see him, because now it's like, one of those performers where it's like, I know if I never saw him, I would probably regret if I missed an opportunity. And now that I have seen him, it's nice. I feel complete in that regard.
So you should, and you got to see him twice.
Yes, double the pleasure, double the fun.
Exactly. Okay, thank you, Cublet, for stopping by and sharing your memories. And you'll be coming up in the next episode when we revisit the Leonard Cohen concert from 9 years later. Another great show.
Oh, yeah, that was an amazing show.
So thanks for now, and we'll talk to you next time. Now, my last memory of the show that I want to discuss is when he performed the song Never Get Old. Now, this was a song off the current album, Reality. And I remember him performing this and looking at him, again, just yards away, singing Never Get Old, and he looked and sounded so good. And I was thinking about, this is an artist. It's going to be like Frank Sinatra. This is going to be someone I'm going to watch go into his older years. He's going to be performing for decades. He was now to the point where he was putting out another album a year at this point. He's completely ramped back up. Bowie's going to be here for ages and ages and ages. And then, of course, that's not at all what happened. 3 months after, just a little under 3 months after the show, on June 25th, he was playing the Hurricane Festival in Germany and had been having chest pains during the show, made it through the show, but was pretty much rushed into emergency surgery in Hamburg right after the gig, and that was it. The remaining 14 shows were canceled, and essentially Bowie's performing career was now over. What had happened was he had a major heart attack, and as happens with many people with big things like this in their life, he survived and he shuffled his priorities. His focus now was really on his family, enjoying his life. He'd pretty much worked for decades, and it was really his daughter, his life, just enjoying life was his focus. And can you blame him? Now, he did perform intermittently in the next few years. There's a few people he went on stage to perform with. Notably, he performed with Dave Gilmour and did that live version of Arnold Lane, which was a hit over in the UK. He performed with Alicia Keys, also the Arcade Fire. But after 2007, that was it. He never performed live on a stage again. The feeling by the end of the 2000s, that first decade, was that he was now officially retired. He was done, no more music, no performance, no nothing. He had walked away from all that life. And so it was a shock at the beginning of 2013 when it was announced that he had a new album and single coming out that he had been recording over the last few years in private. And of course, that became the next day. Now, even that marketing technique, that was a new thing, to do something completely in private and then just drop it, as opposed to the more contemporary way where you spend almost a year building something up and you're almost like fed up of it by the time it arrives. So this became a new thing. Beyonce did that about a year or so later, and a few people have done it where they've suddenly delivered surprise albums. So that in and of itself became a new marketing strategy. The album was a big success. It's a really good album. Once I got the deluxe version, I kind of thought, they left off some of the best tracks, but it was a really great return. And again, I thought, okay, he's going to be recording again. And then in 2014, he released a brand new single. And the single was entitled Sue, or In a Season of Crime. And it was going to be the lead single on this new triple compilation he was putting out called Nothing Has Changed. Now, when I heard this, I thought, oh, okay, well, again, it's just some throwaway track they put on a compilation to entice people to buy the album. And of course, I would be doing so because I was a Bowie fan. And I kind of had a feeling, I was reading, it was recorded, it was sort of had a jazzy feel, and it was recorded with apparently the Maria Schneider Orchestra, this jazz unit from New York. And I kind of had an idea in my head already what it was going to sound like. Kind of like a Sinatra, maybe Let's Dance kind of thing, finger snapping, maybe retro jumping kind of thing, and not of any great consequence. And then the song debuted online, and I listened to it, and it was like, oh my God, it's the most uncommercial single he's ever released. And it's like nothing else I've really heard before. With all the dissonant percussion and sounds. It was completely something new for him. And I went, whoa, and managed to get a vinyl copy, order one of the very few existing vinyl copies. And then on the B-side, there's a song called 'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore, which didn't sound like the A-side, but also sounded like nothing he'd done before, and very sort of dark and chaotic. And it's like, wow, this is new. He's actually doing something new here. And when Black Star came out in January of 2016, I remember going to the HMV early Friday afternoon. Wow, when there were HMVs in Canada. And buying it early Friday afternoon and getting it home, putting it on, and just going, okay, this is it. With Heathen, and the next day he was now back to the level, coming back to the level of quality from the 70s. But when I heard Black Star, I thought, this is it. He's now completely back. He's in charge of his artistic faculties. This is something new. It's not that he's doing something good. This is new. This is really not like anything in his catalog or anything else. And I was just blown away because I thought he has finally gotten back to the place where he was in the later 70s, where he was doing very, very innovative, interesting, and unique work. And I just remember sitting there listening to it thinking, this is like Bob Dylan, Time Out of Mind. Not sonically, they sound very different, obviously. But it's kind of like Dylan went through a really long period in the late 70s and the 80s of early 90s of just a lot of crap. There was a few good ones, and they're mostly crap. And then boom, he's back. And for me, Dylan has made at least 4 absolutely killer albums in the last 25 years. And I thought, this is it. Bowie is now going to be producing all this new music to look forward to that's going to be at this quality. It was very exciting. And the whole weekend, I think I played it 8 or 9 times the whole weekend. I couldn't stop listening to it. And then, of course, Monday morning, he's gone. Incredible. It would have been hard enough in normal circumstances to process that, but that he had just put this album out that was so good. It's like, oh no. And the whole thing, of course, the album is just laden with clues and references to his impending death, which I missed completely listening to the first time around because I was so engaged by how the album sounded. I can honestly say I was devastated by his death. I have never been more affected by the death of someone I didn't know personally. There's also another blog entry on mylifeinconcert.com that I wrote at the time of my feelings about Bowie and how it was affecting me. So it's there as well as that earlier piece I mentioned, Bowie, the 70s and me. So to conclude, I'll really miss that new music that was yet to come because it really did seem like he had all his artistic faculties back. But I'll also really miss seeing him live. I saw him the 5 times and every time was wonderful. I'll also miss his audience and the sense of seeing him. You know, you can be a fan of someone and you go to the gig, but certain acts have better audiences than others, I can say. I think he had the best audience. I can't quite put it into words, but going to his shows, there was just this warm, giddy feeling, the sense of community, and it was very pronounced at these shows in a way that I haven't quite felt elsewhere. So I'm going to miss all of it, but thankfully we have all those amazing albums to listen to, all that music, and also video of the shows. But again, nothing really ever compensates for being there. And I'll just end this with a quote from Hamlet, "I shall not look upon his like again." Thanks for everything, David. Love on ya. And with the passing of David Bowie and this gig, I now jump ahead to episode 6, the last in my introductory 5, looking at a concert from the 2010s, and this time it's the legendary Leonard Cohen, who I only got to see this one and only time, but thank heavens I did. It was one of the best concerts I've ever seen. Now, the show took place on December 7th, 2012 at Scotiabank Place. It's the same place as the Corel Center. I think, what are they now, Canadian Tire Center? The place changes its names the way most people change their socks. And I do have a blog entry for this one, as it was 2012 and I was writing the blog at the time. So you can go on the mylifeinconcert.com website and read concert number 175. I'm your man, Leonard Cohen. Come back next time for some knee-sliding dexterity, elbowing patrons, and compelling intensity. Just a reminder to visit the mylifeinconcert.com website where I have my old blog posts. You can listen to the podcast, and I also have all sorts of other visual ephemera. You can also visit the My Life in Concert YouTube channel, and you can leave comments on the website or the channel. Also remember to like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Once again, this is your host, various artists at the mylifeinconcert.com podcast series. Also, thanks to Cublet for taking the time to share his memories on the show. And as we've seen many shows together, he'll be coming up in various podcasts through the years. Thanks for listening, and come back next time. We'll meet up at the next show. Bye for now.